All display said Mom, but I almost didn't pick up. I was elbow deep in a grant application, the kind you rewrite 17 times and still aren't sure about, and it was already past 10 on a Tuesday night. I answered anyway. I always answered. She didn't say hello. She said, "Your brother needs you to transfer the money back tonight." I didn't understand what she meant. Then she told me what my brother had told her, and the floor dropped out from under me. Let me back up, because this story only makes sense if you understand the setup first. Before I tell you what my dad found on my brother's laptop 3 weeks later, the thing that changed absolutely everything, I want you to drop a comment and tell me where you're reading from. I want to see how far this gets. I'm 31 years old. I live in a second-floor apartment in Gatineau, just across the river from Ottawa. The kind of place with radiators that hiss all winter and a view of a parking lot that somehow still feels like home. I work as a graphic designer for a mid-sized non-profit. I'm not rich, but I'm careful. I've been careful my whole life because I had to be. My brother is 34. His name is not important. What's important is that he has always been the one my mother believed without question. He has a way of speaking, slow, certain, sorrowful, that makes every lie sound like a confession. He discovered this when he was about 9 years old, and he's been using it ever since. The money my mother was asking about was $11,000. That was the amount sitting in a joint savings account my parents had set up years ago, specifically earmarked for my graduate studies. I'd been accepted into a master's program in design research at Concordia. The acceptance had come 2 months earlier. I'd been quietly, carefully planning the move from Gatineau to Montreal, working out budgets in a spreadsheet I kept updated every Sunday night. The $11,000 wasn't everything I'd need, but it was the foundation. My parents had contributed to it over years. Birthdays, Christmases, the occasional "we're proud of you" e-transfer, and so had I, folding in small amounts whenever I could. My brother told my mother I had drained it. He said I'd been in financial trouble for months and hadn't told anyone. He said I'd transferred the money to cover rent arrears and a car repair, and that I'd planned to pay it back before anyone noticed. He said he'd found out because he was worried about me and had been keeping an eye on things. He said all of this with that slow, sorrowful voice. My mother believed him before she finished the sentence. When she called me, she didn't ask what happened. She didn't say, "Is this true?" She said, "Your brother needs you to transfer the money back tonight." As if the verdict had already been handed down and we were in the sentencing phase. I pulled up the account on my banking app while she was still talking. The balance was exactly what it should have been, $11,240, not a cent missing. "Mom," I said, "the money's still there. I'm looking at it right now." She went quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He showed me the transaction history." "Whose transaction history?" She didn't answer. "Mom, whose account did he show you?" He said you'd hidden it, that you'd moved it through another account." I stood up from my desk. I didn't know why standing helped, but it did. "I did not touch that money. I have never touched that money. Can I please talk to him?" She put him on the phone. My brother's voice was exactly what I expected. Quiet, disappointed, tired in a way that performed exhaustion rather than feeling it. He said he'd seen the notification. He said he had screenshots. He said he didn't want to get into it tonight because he could hear I was upset and he was worried about my mental state. That last part, the mental state comment, was the thing that told me exactly what was happening. That's a word he reaches for when he wants to make the other person's version of events seem unreliable. He's been doing it since we were teenagers. He did it to our dad once, back when Dad caught him in something I can't fully remember and I'd watched it work in real time. The accusation reframed the argument. Suddenly, we weren't talking about what he'd done. We were talking about what he'd done. We were talking about whether I was stable enough to discuss it. I hung up. Not angrily, just deliberately. The way you close a door when you realize there's nothing on the other side. I called my dad. My parents divorced when I was 19. They are civil to each other in the way of people who survived something difficult and decided to get on with their lives. My father remarried and lives in a semi-detached in Kanata. He's not a man who shows up dramatically. He shows up practically, with a toolkit or a spreadsheet, or in this case, a very calm voice asking me to start from the beginning. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which is something he has always been able to do, this capacity for stillness. When I finished, he asked 2 questions. He asked whether my brother had ever had access to my account, and I said no, never, not even view access. The account was mine and my mother's names only. And he asked whether my brother still used the old family laptop, the Lenovo that had been sitting in my parents' basement before the divorce, and that had eventually, through a complicated process of nobody wanting it and nobody throwing it out, ended up in my brother's spare room. I said I assumed so. I hadn't thought about that laptop in years. My dad said, "Okay, I'm going to drive over there tomorrow." I want to pause here and describe my father in this moment, because it matters. He didn't say he believed me without conditions. He didn't get emotional. He didn't validate me by attacking my brother. He just said he was going to look into it, in exactly the same tone he'd used to say he was going to look into a dripping faucet. That tone, that absolute undramatic steadiness, was more reassuring than anything else he could have said. It meant he was taking it seriously. It meant he trusted me enough to investigate rather than simply to agree. I didn't sleep that night. I went back to my grant application and stared at it until the words stopped meaning anything. My mother called in the morning to tell me that what I was doing was selfish, that my brother was trying to help me, and that refusing to acknowledge the problem was making everything harder for the family. I let her finish. Then I said, "The money is still in the account, Mom. All of it." She said the screenshots showed otherwise. I asked her to send me the screenshots. She said she'd have to ask my brother. I said, "Please do." She never sent them. My brother texted me that afternoon. He said he was sorry this had become such a thing. He said he'd only told Mom because he cared. He said he hoped I would reach out when I was ready to talk without all the defensiveness. I screenshot the text and sent it to my dad. My dad drove to my brother's place the next morning on the pretext of picking up some old tools he'd left there. My brother let him in, made coffee, sat down at the kitchen table. They talked about nothing for a while, the senator's prospects, the price of everything, whether the winter had been worse than last year. Then my dad asked if he could use the laptop to look something up, said his phone was almost dead. My brother didn't hesitate. He pointed to the spare room. I don't know exactly what my father was looking for or how quickly he found it. He told me later that he just opened the browser and the history was right there, not hidden, not cleared, either because my brother was careless or because he genuinely hadn't considered that anyone would look. The first thing my dad found was a series of searches from 3 weeks ago. Bank account screenshot editor, how to fake an e-transfer screenshot, fake transaction history generator Canada. The searches were time-stamped. They were from the night before my mother called me. My dad sat there in my brother's spare room for a long moment. He told me later he felt something go cold and still in his chest. Not shock exactly, more like the feeling of a suspicion you've held for years finally being confirmed, which is somehow worse than surprise because it means you can't claim you didn't know. He kept looking. The laptop had an old email account logged in. The address my brother had used in his 20s that he'd told everyone he'd abandoned. There was a draft in the folder, not sent. It was addressed to the Concordia Graduate Admissions Office. The subject line was, "Request to withdraw acceptance on behalf of student." My brother had drafted an email withdrawing my acceptance from the master's program. He hadn't sent it yet. I don't know if he was going to. Maybe he lost his nerve. Maybe he was waiting until the family crisis he'd manufactured had run its course and everyone was looking the other way. But the draft was there, dated 4 days ago, written in a formal tone that mimicked official language, claiming to be from me, explaining that due to changed personal circumstances, I was formally withdrawing my application and requesting that the spot be offered to another candidate. My dad photographed everything: the browser history, the draft email, the timestamp on a downloaded fake screenshot app. He sent the photos to me from the driveway before he'd even started the car. When I saw them, I didn't cry. That surprised me. I thought I would. Instead, I felt something clarify inside me, the way fog does in the late morning when the sun finally gets through. Not dramatically, just quietly, the world going from blurred to sharp. I knew exactly what this was. My brother had spent years being the competent one, the established one. The son who had his act together while I was still figuring things out. The fact that I had gotten into a competitive graduate program at a university he'd once applied to and been rejected from, he'd never mentioned that to me directly, but my mother had let it slip at Christmas, apparently mattered to him in a way I hadn't fully understood until that moment. He didn't just want the money. He wanted the momentum to stop. He wanted me to miss the deadline, lose the spot, stay in my apartment in Gatineau, convinced that the foundation my parents had built for me was gone. He didn't want to watch me become more than he thought I deserved to be. I called my mother. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been waiting for me to call back, which meant some part of her had been sitting with doubt she wasn't ready to name. I didn't raise my voice. There are people in my family who express anger loudly, and I have spent enough years around that kind of noise to know it resolves nothing. I said, "I need you to look at something I'm sending you right now. Please don't say anything until you've looked at it." I sent the photos my dad had taken. The silence on the line stretched out long enough that I could hear the refrigerator hum in her kitchen. "Those could be," she started. "Mom." He might have been looking that up for something else. You don't know. "Mom, the draft email. Read the draft email." Another silence. When she spoke again, her voice was different. Not apologetic. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. But different. Hollow in a way that meant the architecture of something had shifted. She said, "I'll call you back." She didn't call back that night. I didn't push. There are battles you win by not fighting them, by just laying down the evidence and stepping back and letting reality do what reality does. My dad, however, was not done. This is the part of the story where I have to tell you about the rest because it matters. When my parents were still married, they'd set up a registered education savings plan for me when I was small. Over the years, between the government grants and their contributions, it had grown into something meaningful. When I turned 18, they converted it to a non-registered savings account rather than cashing it out, keeping it accessible for whenever I needed it for education. That account was the one my mother and I were both named on. My father had been removed from it after the divorce, which was routine, but he was still named as a beneficiary contact in some of the old banking paperwork because neither of my parents had ever gotten around to updating the secondary contact information. Which meant he had grounds to request records. Not access, not control, just documentation, the kind of paper trail that banks maintain and produce when there's a dispute involving a named party. He made the request the following Monday. The records showed my brother had contacted the bank 2 months ago, posing as me. He'd known my date of birth, my old address, partial account details he'd have had access to years ago when we were still a family with loose financial boundaries, and had attempted to add himself as an authorized user on the account. The bank had flagged the request and sent a verification notice to an email address my brother must have thought was mine, but was actually an old joint family email from before the divorce, one my dad still had access to. The verification had never been completed, so the request had never gone through. But the attempt was documented. He hadn't just fabricated a crisis. He'd been trying to get into the account for 2 months. The fabricated screenshots and the story about my financial trouble, that had been a fallback plan, a way to drain the money through guilt and family pressure when the direct route hadn't worked. My father took the bank records to a lawyer, not to launch some dramatic legal campaign, but to understand what options existed and to create a formal paper trail outside the family system. The lawyer's letter, sent to my brother by registered mail, was quiet and precise. It outlined the bank's documentation of the unauthorized access attempt. It noted the fabricated screenshots. It referenced the draft email withdrawing my graduate acceptance. It made no threats. It simply laid out, in the kind of calm, professional language that cannot be argued with or reframed or dismissed as someone being emotional or unstable, what had happened and what it could lead to if not addressed. My brother called my mother the day he received it. I was not in that conversation. My mother told me about it afterward, and her account was so careful, so measured, so stripped of the dramatics she usually brings to family conflicts that I knew it had shaken something fundamental in her. She said he'd cried. She said he'd told her he was in debt. That he'd made some investments last year that hadn't gone the way he'd planned. That he'd panicked. That he hadn't been thinking clearly. She said he'd used the word temporary about 4 times in a row. She said she'd told him to stop talking. I don't know what my mother felt in that moment. I think she's still working it out. There are parents who, when one child has been harmed by another, rush to protect the injured one. And there are parents who, when the scaffolding of their preferred version of the family collapses, go quiet for a long time before they can figure out where to stand. My mother is the second kind. I've made a certain peace with that. It doesn't mean she doesn't love me. It means the love gets complicated by the story she needs to tell herself about who her children are. She called me a week later. She said, "I'm sorry I didn't ask you first." Just that. No elaboration, no explanation, no "but you have to understand your brother." I said, "Thank you." We stayed on the phone for a few more minutes talking about nothing in particular, the way you do when you're both trying to find your way back to something that still exists but needs to be located carefully. My enrollment at Concordia was never in danger. The draft had never been sent. I checked with the admissions office just to be certain, and the woman I spoke with was so matter-of-fact and kind that I wanted to thank her more than the situation warranted. She confirmed my acceptance, my start date, everything intact. I moved to Montreal in August. My brother and I have not spoken since the lawyer's letter. I don't know if that's permanent. I suspect that depends on whether he ever gets to a place where he can acknowledge what he did without hiding it inside the language of having been in a bad place, of not having been himself, of it being something that happened to him rather than something he chose. I'm 31 years old, and I don't have the energy anymore to wait for people to become the version of themselves that the situation requires. My dad helped me move. He drove the rental van from Canada to Montreal on a Saturday in August when the highway was thick with summer traffic and the city smelled of hot pavement and someone's barbecue drifting from a balcony above the parking lot. He assembled my new IKEA bed frame without complaining once, even the part where the directions were wrong. We ordered pizza from a place around the corner and sat on the floor of my new apartment eating it out of the box. And he said, looking around at the bare walls and the unpacked boxes and the radiator that would hiss all winter, "You earned this." I thought about all the ways that was true and didn't say any of them. The master's program started in September. The grant application I'd been working on that Tuesday night when my mother called, the one about designing accessible public information systems for Francophone communities, got funded in November. Some people think they can own your future by controlling the path that leads to it. They think if they take away the resources, delete the confirmation, make you doubt yourself at the exact moment you need to be certain, they can keep you in a place that feels smaller than where you're going. They're wrong. And now, finally, this life is mine. There's a specific kind of quiet that follows a betrayal when you finally stop trying to explain yourself. I remember standing in my apartment in Gatineau that Tuesday night, the grant application open on my screen, my mother's words still in my ear, and thinking, I could spend the next week proving what didn't happen, or I could just let the truth do what truth eventually does. I chose the second thing, not because I was calm, I wasn't, but because I'd watched enough of my family's arguments to know that the loudest voice in the room rarely wins anything worth winning. What my brother did wasn't impulsive. He'd been searching how to fabricate bank screenshots. He'd drafted an email to Concordia in my name. He'd been attempting to get into my account for 2 months. That's not a person who panicked. That's a person who looked at someone else's progress and made a deliberate series of choices to stop it. Understanding that was important to me, not so I could feel angrier, but so I could be clear-eyed about what I was actually dealing with. There's a difference between forgiving someone who stumbled and forgiving someone who planned. I'm still working out which side of that line this falls on. My dad never once told me what to feel about it. He just went and looked. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Not the drama of the discovery, but the simple act of a person deciding that the truth matters enough to go find it. He didn't need me to perform distress for him to take it seriously. He took it seriously because it was serious. That kind of integrity, the kind that operates the same whether or not anyone is watching, is rarer than people admit. I think about the version of this story where I didn't call him, where I just absorbed my mother's accusation and started doubting myself, the way I'd been trained since childhood to do whenever my brother's version of events conflicted with mine. I would have missed the enrollment deadline. The draft email would have eventually been sent. The scholarship I'd spent years working toward would have dissolved, and I might have spent years believing it was somehow my fault. The thing that stopped that from happening wasn't luck. It was the fact that I knew, with the kind of bone-level certainty that doesn't need to be argued, that I hadn't done what he said I'd done. That clarity, holding on to your own account of events when someone you trust is telling you you're wrong, that's not stubbornness. That's something harder and more important. It's knowing the difference between reconsidering because you might be wrong and backing down because someone is applying pressure. My mother said sorry in 7 words. I don't think she'll ever fully explain herself to me, and I've made a kind of peace with that. She had to choose in that moment between the story she told herself about her family and the evidence on her screen. That's a painful choice. I don't need her to have made it faster. I just need her to have made it. I'm in Montreal now. The radiator hisses. The grant came through. The master's program is exactly as hard as I hoped it would be. I think what this whole thing taught me is that you can't protect your future by being passive about it. You have to build it, document it, defend it when necessary, and trust the people who show up with tools instead of opinions. The rest mostly takes care of itself.